Hello and welcome. Jackie Edwards here, author of 2 best-selling rent-to-rent books that you can grab on Amazon. And in those books, I do talk in more detail about contracts. And today we are talking about contracts in this video. Now, this video is going to be something super simple that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the top 3 things that you must include in your rent-to-rent contracts. Now, these are things that you really need to have pinned down with the landlord. Of course, there are a lot of other things that you must include in your contracts. I am not a solicitor. I am not a lawyer. So you have to, if you have questions, detailed questions about contracts, and you don't feel comfortable with them, you need to talk to a solicitor or a lawyer. And this is a business expense for, anybody starting up a business would have some legal fees to get started. Consider this as one of yours. Now, I do have contracts available on my website at renttorentacademy.co.uk. So you can check those out, read through them. Again, they're for educational purposes. I'm not a solicitor. I am an accountant. I read through millions of contracts, probably not millions, that might be exaggerating, but I read through a lot of contracts back in my accounting days, so I am very comfortable and confident with contracts, but I'm not a solicitor. So while I'm going to talk about the top 3 things that need to be included in your rent-to-rent contract, there are, of course, other detailed legally type things that your solicitor will help you with. But today we're going to talk about the things that you need to have negotiated and have really clear with your landlord to make sure that your rent-to-rent contract works in the long term. The first thing is that you need to have agreed a set amount of rent. Now that might sound like, no kidding, duh, that's of course, but sometimes I've seen people, they might have a set amount of rent for the first year and then just say, and then we'll, negotiate rent every year. Or, we'll have the opportunity for a rent increase at the end of the first year. But they won't give that a set amount. Now, you could get to the end of your first year, and the landlord's like, all right, I'm going to double your rent. And you're like, whoa, that doesn't work. And then you're kind of stuck in it. So I want you to make sure that you're really specific in your contract and with your landlord about the rent and any rent increase clauses. So maybe, you start at £1,000 for the first year, and it goes up by 3% every year. That is a good set amount. You can calculate that every year and you'll know exactly how much your contract is increasing. You could say it goes up by £100 every year, £500 every year. You can say it doesn't go up at all. I've had contracts that have been the same exact amount every year for 5 years. So the key is, do whatever you need to do to negotiate it, but just make sure it's super, super clear what that amount is and what it's going to be going forward so that you can plan on that. I liked to use 3% when landlords wanted an increase clause because that's kind of a standard, inflation is expected to be about 3%. You can generally increase your tenant's rent by 3% every year, that type of thing. All right, number 2, these ones get a little bit more tricky. You want to make sure that you've got a clause in there, and this is almost 2, but that talk about the owner being responsible for his insurance and his mortgage, and if it's a flat, for any leaseholders, that they are responsible for any of the other contracts they have in place on this property. You should make sure that you tell them exactly what you're doing with the property. So if you're doing HMOs or service accommodation, you're telling them that. You're telling them how many tenants are going to be living in there, if there's locks on the bedroom doors, any kind of changes you're making. You need to make sure the landlord knows so that he can make sure his insurance is correct, his mortgage is correct, that his leaseholder will be happy, all of those things. But he's responsible for those. So you should not be reading the owner's mortgage contract or their insurance agreement, because more likely than not, you are not a mortgage broker or an insurance broker. Both of those are regulated activities. You need to have a license, you need to have training, you need to be certified in order to give people mortgage advice and insurance advice. If you are not qualified to do those things, and maybe you've just read the owner's mortgage, you're like, yeah, that sounds good. You go ahead, and then 2 years down the road, the mortgage company's like, red flags, we're repossessing, it was all wrong. The owner comes back to you and was like, well, I gave you my contract to read, and you said everything was fine. I took you at your word, now I'm going to sue you. So you need to make sure that you're very, very careful about this. So you give the owner everything that they need so that they can have that discussion with their mortgage company and with their insurance broker. So I suggest you have a clause in your contract that says something simple like, you, Mr. Owner, are responsible for your mortgage and your insurance requirements. whatever it is. Again, a solicitor can help you make the wording appropriate for however it goes. Um, but that needs to be in there. So that kind of pushes the onus back on them. And if they've got questions about it, you can say, oh, that's, you should talk to your mortgage company or your mortgage broker. If you don't know one, here I've got the name of a great mortgage broker you can talk to, or here's the name of a great insurance broker you can talk to. But don't be involved in any way that makes it look like you've given them insurance or mortgage advice. All right, so we've covered number 1, how much the rent is going to be. Covered number 2, the owner's responsibility for the mortgage and the insurance. Number 3 is maintenance. You need to be super, super clear as to who's responsible for what in regards to maintenance and property upkeep. That you can structure this any way you want. The world is your oyster for negotiating who's paying for repairs and maintenance. But whatever you've negotiated and whatever you agree with the landlord, you need to make sure that's specified in your contract. So I know people that, the rent-to-renter will pay the first £50 of maintenance every month. And then everything after that is the landlord's responsibility. Maybe it's the first £100 of maintenance, and then after that's the landlord's responsibility. For me, I covered all the internal non-structural damage, including white goods and boilers, and the owner was responsible for any structural damage to the property. So it can be whatever you want it to be and whatever suits that property and that owner and that situation. But you need to make sure it's really clear in the contract of who's doing what. And this will probably be some of your wordiest bits in your contract, depending on how you structure this, so you can make sure it's really clear. I want to recommend keeping it as simple as possible. So if you can do something like you'll pay for the first £50 of maintenance and the landlord's responsible for the rest, that's probably one of the easiest ways to do it. Maybe make sure there's some kind of time frames, how you're gonna do it. Is he gonna pay? Is he gonna organize everything? Or are you gonna organize and pay it and then hold back the money from the rent? Or is he gonna pay you back after? Make sure that stuff is clear in your contract of how you're going to do that, as clear as possible. Because this is one of the areas where you're most likely to have a falling out with the owner, is over maintenance. So something big breaks and the owner says it's your responsibility, you say it's their responsibility. Maybe you pay for all the repairs and they're like, well, I'm not going to pay you back for that, blah, 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 blah. So make sure you've got it really clear in your contract how it works. Do you have to notify them before you have it done? How is it going to happen? And how can you make sure that it's clear and that you and the landlord are covered and safe and you have a process for that? That is probably the trickiest one of all the things that we've talked about, because that's where there's an area for the most complexities to arise. So how are you going to structure it to keep it as simple as possible and as clear as possible so that anybody that reads that can understand, this is your responsibility, this is my responsibility, here's how it's going to happen. All right. So again, let's run through it. You want to make sure you've got the rent in there and that it's a set amount, that there's no wiggle room, that there's no way there's going to be an unknown in the future of, the rent can increase by any amount. You'll just have a rent review. Number 2, you want to make sure that the owner, that you've pointed out to the owner that they've got responsibility for their mortgage and their insurance and their leasehold contract and any other contracts they've got on the property. And 3, you want to make sure that your maintenance schedule and your maintenance plan is super, super clear in the contract of who does what. Now, if you've got those in your contract, you have a really good solid base for your agreement, and your solicitor can kind of make all the other words work in there. So hopefully you found that useful. Again, if you want more information on contracts, check out my books or my courses or grab my contracts from the internet or speak to your lawyer or solicitor. And I will see you in the next video.